Your alarm goes off. Your eyes are still closed. But your hand already knows exactly where to go. It lands on the phone before you're even awake enough to want it. Thumb finds the screen. Screen lights up. You're scrolling before your brain has said one conscious word. You didn't choose that. Not really. Nobody voted on it. Somewhere between asleep and awake, some version of you that isn't fully online yet ran the whole routine on autopilot. Maybe for you it isn't the phone. Maybe it's the fridge door, open, and you're standing in the light of it, not even hungry. Maybe it's the fingernail between your teeth before you've noticed your hand moved at all. Maybe it's the pack of cigarettes you swore, out loud in front of people you were finally done with. You've probably tried the obvious fix. Just stop. Decide harder. White-knuckle it. And it probably worked for about as long as you could hold your breath. Then, quietly, the habit came back, like it had never left. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. That routine you didn't choose has a name and a shape. Researchers call it the habit loop. A cue starts it. A routine runs it. A reward locks it in, and the next time that same cue shows up, your brain skips straight to the routine because it already knows the reward is coming. A writer named Charles Duhigg spent years pulling scattered lab research into that one loop in a book called The Power of Habit. Once you see cue, routine, reward, you start noticing it running underneath almost everything you do without thinking. For the first piece of this, you have to go inside a maze. Not yours. A rat's. In the late 1990s, a neuroscientist named Graybiel at MIT wired up rats and sent them running a simple T-shaped maze over and over toward the reward at the end. Early on, her recordings showed exactly what you'd expect. The rat's brain, specifically a region deep in the middle called the striatum, fired steadily the entire run, thinking, in a sense, the whole way through, deciding, checking, adjusting. But after enough repetitions, something changed. The activity in that region collapsed. It went quiet in the middle of the maze and only spiked at the very start and the very end, the beginning of the run and the reward at the finish. The middle just disappeared from the brain's perspective. The behavior didn't stop. The rat still turned correctly every time. It just stopped being a decision. The brain had chunked the whole routine into a single unit, start and finish, with nothing in between that needed active thought anymore. Picture a groove worn into a dirt path by 100 people walking the exact same line. Nobody's choosing that path consciously by day 50. Their feet just fall into the groove that's already there because it's less effort than cutting a new one. That's what a habit is. Physically, a groove worn into your brain, because the loop repeated often enough that repetition became the cheapest option available. Here's the strange part. And it's the part that actually matters if you're trying to break one of these. You'd think, logically, that once you replace a bad habit with a better one, the old groove just fills back in. Gone. Overwritten. It doesn't work that way. In 2012, the same MIT lab, now led by Kyle Smith working with Graybiel, found something unsettling in those same rats. Even after the animals learned a completely new routine, the old one hadn't been erased from the brain at all. It was still there. Encoded, waiting. They found a small patch of tissue at the front of the brain acting almost like a switch, deciding in the moment which of the two routines actually plays out, the new one or the old one. Damage that switch or overload it with enough stress, and the old habit can snap back instantly, fully formed, like it was never gone. So if you've ever broken a habit for months, maybe years, and then had one bad week bring the whole thing roaring back overnight, that's the actual architecture talking, not a failure of willpower. The old groove was never filled in. It was just switched off, and the switch is more fragile than anyone likes to admit. You're running exactly the hardware everyone else is running. That also lines up with something almost everyone's noticed on their own. Old habits don't usually creep back during a calm, well-slept week. They come back hardest, exactly when stress spikes. A bad night's sleep, a deadline, a fight, all the conditions that lean hardest on that same fragile switch. Now, here's why that matters more than it sounds like it should. In 2002, researchers Wendy Wood, Jeffrey Quinn, and Deborah Kashey asked people to log what they did, hour by hour, for real days of their actual lives, then checked how much of it was deliberately chosen in the moment versus running on the loop, close to half. Something near 40% of everyday behavior turned out to be habitual, performed almost automatically in the same place, at the same time, in response to the same cue, day after day. That's just what the data showed. Chances are, right now, close to half of what fills your average day was decided by a version of you from weeks or months ago, not the version sitting here listening to this. So how do you actually get in there and change it? Wood ran another study, a few years later, on college students who just switched universities. New dorm, new commute, none of the old routine's usual cues anywhere in sight, and she found something useful hiding in the disruption. Old habits that depended on the old environment's specific cues were dramatically weaker after the move. The cue that used to trigger the routine simply wasn't there anymore, so the routine had nothing left to run on. Psychologists call that window habit discontinuity. Any real disruption to your usual context, a move, a new job, even a long trip, temporarily loosens the grip of habits tied to the old setting, because the cues that used to fire the loop automatically aren't around anymore. That's likely part of why some of the biggest habit changes in a person's life cluster around a move, a breakup, a new job. Not because those moments hand you extra willpower, but because they scramble the exact cues that used to run the old loop automatically. Which brings us to a number you've almost certainly heard, and it's wrong. 21 days. It shows up everywhere. Self-help books, productivity apps, that poster taped up in your gym's locker room. As if there's some clean deadline where a new habit locks into place. This is where that number actually came from. In 1960, a plastic surgeon named Maxwell Maltz noticed his patients seemed to take about 3 weeks to get used to their new face after surgery, and he wrote that observation into a book. Not about habits, about adjusting to a changed appearance. Somewhere along the way, that offhand observation got copied, simplified, and repeated until it turned into a hard rule for something it was never measured on. In 2010, researchers actually measured it. Phillippa Lally and her team at University College London tracked people building a new habit in real life and timed exactly how long it took before the behavior started running automatically. The real median was 66 days, not 21, and the range was enormous, anywhere from 18 days on the fast end to 254 days on the slow end, depending on the habit and the person. There's a reassuring wrinkle buried in that data, too. A single missed day, one slip, didn't meaningfully change the timeline at all. The habit kept forming anyway. Consistency over time builds the groove, not a perfect streak. So if the groove never fully disappears, and the timeline is closer to 2 months than 3 weeks, what actually works? Duhigg's research pointed to what he called the golden rule of habit change, and it's simpler than it sounds. You keep the cue exactly the same. You keep the reward exactly the same. You change only the routine sitting in the middle. Picture that groove again, the worn path. You're not filling it in from scratch. You're digging a second path, right next to it, that starts at the same spot and ends at the same spot, just taking a different route in between. Reach for your phone the second you wake up? Keep the cue, waking up, and keep some version of the reward, stimulation, connection, distraction. Just swap the routine, reach for a book instead, or open a different app entirely, something that satisfies the same itch without the same cost. The second lever comes from a psychologist named Peter Gollwitzer working with Pascal Sheeran. They study plans with a very specific shape, called implementation intentions. If this happens, then I will do that. Not a vague goal like eat healthier. A wired-in trigger tied to an exact cue. Across dozens of studies, comparing people who just held a goal in their head against people who wrote an actual if-then plan tied to a cue, the if-then group followed through far more often. The plan does the work your willpower was never built to do alone. It preloads the decision before the moment of temptation ever shows up, so there's nothing left to figure out in the moment your resolve is weakest. It works whether the cue is waking up and reaching for a phone or walking past a vending machine at 3 in the afternoon. Name the cue precisely enough, and the routine that used to run on autopilot has something specific to compete with, instead of a vague promise to just try harder next time. Put all of that together and the picture looks nothing like the one you probably grew up with. A habit isn't a character flaw carved into you. It's a groove, worn in through repetition. encoded by a brain trying to save effort wherever it can. That groove doesn't disappear when you stop using it. It just goes quiet, guarded by a switch that's more fragile than it should be. Real change was never about erasing anything. It's about building a second path next to the first one, using the same cue, aiming at the same reward, and giving yourself an if-then plan that fires before temptation gets a vote. And the whole thing runs on a timeline measured in months, with room for bad days built right into the math. Even a plain change of scenery does some of the work for you because it knocks loose the exact cues the old loop depended on. So the next time your hand reaches for the phone before your eyes are even open, or you find yourself standing in front of an open fridge you didn't mean to open, don't read that as some kind of failure of character. Read it as a groove, doing exactly what a groove does. Running the path of least resistance, because somewhere back down the line, you and your brain wore that path in together. The groove stays right where it is. But you've got a second path now, and it wasn't there before. What cue is running your day right now, without you ever agreeing to it? And what's the one if-then plan you could set up tonight, small enough to actually keep, that starts digging a second path next to it? You don't need 21 days. You've got longer than that, and honestly, you always did.